Greetings, and welcome to the What to Expect When You're Directing conference call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. A question-and-answer session will follow the formal presentation. If anyone should require operator assistance during the conference, please press star 0 on your telephone keypad. I would now like to turn the conference over to your host, Ms. Cynthia Krus. Thank you, Ms. Krus. You may begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Cynthia Krus, and I would like to welcome you to our BDC Directors Training Series. I'm joined today by Lisa Morgan, a partner on our team, and Terri Jordan, a senior associate in our group. They both work with me extensively on board matters. Before we get started today, if you have any questions during the webcast, please submit via the Ask Question text box, and we will attempt to answer them at the end of the webinar. If we're not able to get to all of your questions, feel free to call us separately. We've been asked for many years whether there was any specific training program for BDC directors. So after participating in the industry for about 20 years, I decided we would just go ahead and start one. We were actually just calculating how many meetings we go to on an annual basis within just the three of us, and we're close to 1,000. We've experienced not only normal board activities, but also situations where boards have gotten into crisis and emergency situations. We intend to cover a number of topics today, but we also intend to have a series of these webinars over the course of the year, and I believe we've already scheduled 3 of them. The next one we hope will be in March or April. To begin, just to talk about BDCs for a minute. BDCs obviously are a regulated fund, but I believe that they are one of the most regulated funds there is in existence, because not only are you regulated by the 40 Act, which we'll talk about and which affects a lot of the board activities, but also the 33 Act, the 34 Act, and then also the Advisors Act. The duties are much beyond that of a traditional operating company, and they specifically go to basically having a pool of assets, and effectively the board is managing or overseeing that there's nothing done that would be a conflict or removing any funds from that pool of assets. Over the course of the past year, the SEC has been very focused on private equity type investing, which is very similar to what the BDC model does. In addition, other constituencies such as the shareholders, market participants, have also had an increased focus on governance. And as everyone knows in the BDC industry, there's been a significant amount of shareholder activism, and a number of the issues that have arisen in that shareholder activism have been surrounded by governance issues. So this landscape continues to change and evolve, and one of the main areas that BDC directors have to look to is the 15C process, the process in which you're approving the contract for the external advisor. The SEC has focused on that extensively through their OC process as well as through enforcement. As a result, the preparation and determination of what's appropriate for a 15C process has expanded, I would say, exponentially. So this is one of the most important features of what the board of directors has to do on an annual basis. So I bring up, again, as an example, that just yesterday there was a conclusion to a lawsuit where a BDC was challenged on the amount of fees that were being paid, and that was the case in connection with Prospect. There's been a number of these types of cases in the mutual fund environment. No one has actually prevailed, and actually a motion to dismiss was granted yesterday. And I'll just take a second to read the conclusion, because I think we can all take we can all exhale as a result of that. It says, in sum, the allegations concerning the Gartenberg factors failed to set forth facts creating a plausible inference that the fees paid to the defendants were so disproportionately large that they bear no reasonable relationship to the services rendered and fell outside the range of what arm's length bargaining could produce. The complaint fails to state a Section 36B claim upon which relief could be granted. So I do believe that one of the things that when directors are going through the process is extensive, but I would also say that the standard by which the effectively the board has to determine what is reasonable, that standard survived. However, even though that happened yesterday, again, when I opened up my emails, there was a little bit of a gasp because the Trump administration new directive to all agencies to suspend finalizing proposed rules and regulations affected the SBIC program. And there's currently a pending rule under the passive business rule which allows for the formation of blocker corporations for RIC purposes that had to be suspended. Here's the email that came this morning at 8:43. A memorandum from the SBA. A memorandum dated January 20th, 2017 from to the President and Chief of Staff calls for agencies to temporarily postpone the effective date of published rules not effective and invite new public comment. The SBIC passive rule with an original effective date of January 27, 2017 is subject to this guidance. The SBA is delaying the effective date of the rule until March 21st, 2017 and is inviting additional public comment on the final rule. And the point of spending time on those two things is that one of the most important things in the BDC directors area is that this is an evolving climate in which we're living in, and it's something that has to be a part of what you're being informed about to your, from your management teams. And I would expect, and we'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, that this will continue over the course of the next several years. Just to talk for a minute about composition, about what's happened with BDCs over the past couple of years. When I started, the BDCs were basically a single fund, and now effectively you've got BDC managers that have several funds and they're a part of an institutional platform. In addition, there's a number of different types. There's the non-traded, the private, and the newest type of closed-end fund the BDC managers are participating in, interval funds. All of these forms of BDCs are something that the board of directors has to grapple with and keep up to speed, especially if your management team is effectively trying to start a new fund. As boards have evolved over time, we've also seen where there's a number of BDCs that have the multiple funds to have overlapping directors. Having overlapping directors can create some conflicts, so you have to deal with it at the board level. In addition, as a result of the fact that almost all BDCs are now externally managed, there is a much greater use of independent counsel. This is something that is done very frequently in the mutual fund governance area. And as a result, there's independent counsel that may be there either independent of your fund counsel, or your fund counsel can act as your independent counsel, fund counsel, and you have a separate advisor counsel. There's a number of different ways to deal with this, but this is a growing trend. A few years ago, there was hardly any BDCs with an independent counsel. Now there's over 10 of them that have independent counsel acting for a number of funds. So just having walked through these various pieces of regulatory and legislative and executive initiatives, what I want to say is that in order to be an effective board is you have to have balance. You have a lot more obligations as a result of the type of 40 Act requirements on you, but you also have an amount of time that you have to spend on actually administering the business. So it's the balance that we're going to try and talk about and how we can effectively help you manage your process as you're going forward. So what we're going to talk about today, after that introduction, is effectively what BDC directors should expect, what the BDC directors should expect from your management teams, and then some of the regulatory initiatives. What I would say at the beginning of this is that the SEC looks at the board of directors as the watchdog. They can't be managing every one of the funds or regulating every one of the funds on a day-to-day basis, so that's why they look to the independent board as their gatekeeper. So Terri, is going to talk about the first phase of this discussion, and I'm going to ask her questions, but she's going to start out with a question.
Right, Cynthia. My first question actually for you is, why are we doing this webinar now? What's important about this time of year that directors should keep in mind?
This time of year is very important because there's a number of things that have to be accomplished under the 1940 Act. There has to be, you basically have to do it on an annual basis. In addition to the type of things that you have to do for a normal board with the proxy statement, an annual meeting, and doing your disclosures, you also have to go back and look at various pieces of compliance and making sure that those are all in place, including, for example, the auditor and then the 15C process that I mentioned. And so what we're going to try and do is give you some practical advice on how to basically manage all those responsibilities. And one of my practical advice on this one is do a calendar this time of year. Make sure you've got all your obligations, whether they're compliance-oriented or regulatory or disclosure-oriented, put them on in one place. And one of the things that you have to do is a proxy statement for an annual meeting. So I would actually calculate out what your annual meeting dates are going to be and work backwards so that you know when you're going to have meetings. And I think that that's very helpful. So Terri, what is expected of a director of a 40 Act company? Just to start off and give us a little bit of detail.
Thanks, Cynthia. I think in order to really understand what's expected of BDC directors, we have to take a step back and discuss the regulatory and legal framework that sets the expectation for directors. In short, and this is absolutely a summary, the role of the BDC board is to oversee the management and operations of the BDC on behalf of the BDC shareholders. The board has general oversight responsibilities, including monitoring investment performance, risk management, custody of assets, and shareholder services, as well as setting long-term strategies. Importantly, the board is also involved in quarterly fair value determinations, overseeing the BDC's compliance function, and as Cynthia mentioned, the 15C process, which is approving the advisory contract and corresponding fees paid to the investment advisor for its services. And significantly, for the members of the BDC management that may be on this call today, the board also appoints the officers who run the day-to-day operations of the BDC. I like to think that there's three buckets or sources that are the sources of the director's responsibilities. The first is state law, which, as most of you know, for BDCs is either Maryland or Delaware. The second is federal securities laws. As Cynthia mentioned, most significantly for BDCs, the 40 Act imposes specific responsibilities on independent directors. Among those are to guard against conflicts of interest, protect the integrity of the fund's assets, prohibit potentially problematic affiliated transactions and other forms of self-dealing, protect against potentially unfair and unsound capital structures, pursue transparency and accuracy of valuation, and ensure that investors receive appropriate and accurate information. And the final bucket is obviously for listed BDCs, which is to adhere to stock exchange requirements. So that's a lot. So to answer the question of the typical time commitment for a director, you have to first keep in mind that it varies depending on the BDC, how active the board is, the maturity of the BDC's portfolio, and whether any extraordinary events or strategic transactions are taking place. With that caveat, I'd probably estimate that a typical BDC director spends 15 to 20 working days on their director duties at a minimum. Here's how I'd probably break it down. There are at least 4 regularly scheduled quarterly meetings every year that span 1 to 2 days, plus valuation meetings, and the time for those valuation meetings could vary depending on the size of the BDC's portfolio. Meeting materials likely take at least a day to thoroughly review when they come out. There are strategic planning meetings that directors are involved in, which we will discuss in more detail later, as well as meetings related to general compliance and governance. Directors also engage in professional reading, as well as attending educational programs. For example, this one, as well as our annual BDC Roundtable. And of course, extra time could be devoted to extraordinary events, strategic transactions, litigation, takeover attempts, shareholder solicitations, and service on special committees.
So Terri, just to move a little bit down to the actual board meeting itself, who should set up the agenda or make sure that all the matters you just enumerated were covered?
In a typical setting, it's usually the lead director that, together with management, usually the CEO, that sets an agenda, and they get input from the other directors as well. Outside counsel and counsel to the board, if they're different, and we'll talk more about that, are typically involved. It's worth noting that we strongly encourage all the boards we work with to have an annual calendar, which Cynthia mentioned. It puts together the schedule of all the items the board must consider and vote on during the year. It doesn't have to be hard and fast, but that way you're eliminating surprise approvals and it leaves some room for flexibility.
And I would add on the calendar, I wouldn't just put the calendar dates for when the meetings are, but also when materials are going to be posted and that type of thing. And when I say posted, there's a lot of boards now using the electronic portals, and I think that those have advanced quite a bit. And if you're not using one now, especially with the amount of paperwork that you get in a BDC circumstance, I would suggest you might want to look into that electronic portal. It's also a convenient way to keep everything and not be carrying around a lot of papers. When should the agenda be distributed?
We usually recommend at least, at a very minimum, a week before the board meeting, which gives the board adequate time to prepare for the meeting and management to respond to any requests or changes that come up.
And what should directors expect to see on a BDC agenda, and how much time should each director spend on valuations and compliance?
So I think before I rattle off the list of things that you would expect to see on an agenda, including the regular and special items that the board looks at, it's worth noting that we recommend that boards at least annually hold a strategy session. And that's to avoid preventing meetings from becoming rote, like the list I'm going to read off, as well as to fulfill that strategic planning function. So in terms of regular things that the board of directors works on that you'll see pop up on your agendas are valuations and determination of net asset value, review of periodic filings, your SEC filings, business updates, compliance review and updates, and here I would suggest that you also do a quarterly review of BDC-specific compliance testing. Those are items like good and bad asset testing, eligible portfolio company testing, asset coverage ratios, RIC testing, that sort of thing. You're likely on a quarterly basis going to review the allocations of expenses if that's applicable, as well as receive reports from board committees. On an annual basis, you're going to do the big ticket items, things like Cynthia mentioned, the 15C review of the investment advisory contract and the 38A1 annual report of the CCO and review of compliance policies and procedures. So those are really the major areas you'll see covered on the agenda, and then intermittently, of course, you'll see things like transactions, special situations, and changes to fundamental company documents, for example, changes to your charter, that sort of thing.
Right, and just to point out that we keep talking about valuation in the 50C process. We actually believe that those are so significant that we would go into each one of those in individual sessions or webinars. So that's why we're focusing today on basically the actual meetings and other items that effectively affect the board. I would mention that one of the things that we do get comments about from other board members and people involved with BDCs is effectively that there is too much compliance, and there's too much focus. And I think that what you heard from Terri was, having a strategic meeting and that type of thing where you maybe go away for a day or two is very helpful to make sure that the board is focused on that overseeing that strategic emphasis, because there is a fair bit of things that have to be done on an annual and quarterly basis. The other thing I would just mention one more time that Terri mentioned was there really hasn't been a focus on doing compliance or doing regulatory updates kind of on a quarterly basis. That is something that we have seen change in the past couple of years, and that it really is, as I pointed out at the beginning, things happening quarterly or almost day to day that the board needs to be aware of. So I would just say that that is something that we would consider at this point a best practice, and people might want to look back at their boards and see if they're doing that.
Absolutely.
So the next question I have, just beyond the board meeting itself, there's a lot of discussion about executive sessions, maybe just talk a little bit about which different types of executive sessions and whether you need an agenda or not.
Sure. Boards meet frequently in executive sessions with just the independent directors, or they'll have an executive session that's separate with the CEO and or the CFO and or the CCO as appropriate. Both the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ require scheduled executive sessions. But New York Stock Exchange requirement is once a year and NASDAQ is twice a year. Another benefit besides just meeting your regulatory requirements to scheduling your executive session is that regularly scheduled meetings avoid the potential for negative inferences associated with calling the executive session on an ad hoc basis. As a practical matter, we really do recommend scheduling executive sessions to be held at each regularly scheduled board meeting. That being said, it's not necessary to produce an agenda for that specific executive session. Unless there's an item that requires input, we recommend the executive session to serve as a forum for directors of topics that may be sensitive to address in the presence of management, and that can be done on an ad hoc basis.
And just to comment a little bit more on executive sessions, I actually wasn't convinced that they would be very helpful on a normal course basis unless you had some type of investigation or litigation that you were dealing with. But actually having the board talk with or without members of management in a more of an informal setting, I think has actually been very helpful to the good functioning of the board. And I would say that the board members, because the board members don't get a chance to meet and interact with each other very much, other than maybe a board dinner and that type of thing. But it actually does focus the discussion on whether the process is being, the board's running well, whether they're being given the right information, whether they want more information and what kind of format it needs to be in. Some of these issues come up, and if you didn't have the kind of discussion, you may not hear about it. In addition, one of the things you might want to think about, there's no requirement of it, but what do you do after you have the executive session? For example, what if you do want something presented in a different way? How do you get that back to the management team? And so you can do it, again, on an ad hoc basis, but sometimes it's just helpful to have one of the members of the board be the designated individual who goes back to, for example, the CEO. You don't have to tell them everything that's happened at executive session, but if there's something to be acted on or there's an issue that you want presented, it's a good line of communication. So if you want to think about that, that's very helpful. So Terri, speaking of executive sessions, how often are boards meeting in executive session?
Often it's, as we said, it's held in connection with a regularly scheduled board meeting. A question that keeps coming up with respect to executive sessions is when to hold it: before the meeting, after the meeting, the night before. At the end of the day, we recommend that you experiment and see what works best for you, for your board, and you can always alter your plans accordingly. So when you have an executive session after a board meeting, it's going to enable your independent directors to discuss their reactions to the matters raised during the board meeting. It's typically easier from an administrative standpoint because the other board meeting attendees who are not participating in the executive session can be excused at that point. You don't have to worry about excusing them, then inviting them back. You're just done. However, the problem that we've run into from a practical standpoint is that you risk director fatigue holding them at the end of the meeting, and you risk running afoul of people's flight plans and trains and that sort of thing. If you hold an executive session before your board meeting, you're going to allow your directors to discuss the board agenda items and the board material and better prepare for the board meeting to allow for a productive meeting, but it doesn't allow you to respond to actually what comes up during the meeting. So there are trade-offs to both approaches.
Okay, great. So we just wanted to talk about effectively now what should directors expect from their management team. So now we've talked about what the board might expect to see on an agenda, what they may be addressing during a meeting, and some of the other issues around executive sessions. One of the things that we did want to add here is because we're trying to focus on the BDC industry primarily, we did look to see what the size of a board of directors is. And it really depends on whether you're listed or non-listed, but effectively we came away with the fact that most boards that are up and running are between 5 and 7 for the most part. but obviously that will change or be different depending on the size of your board. So, Lisa, how many interested directors are there on a board?
Thanks, Cynthia. Short answer is it depends. As Cynthia pointed out, boards really range in size from 3 to 7 directors, but the size of the BDC board is usually dictated by the size of the BDC. So here under the 40 Act regime, we're also constrained by the requirement that the majority of the board of directors must be comprised of independent directors. So with that in mind, with a board of 3, you're looking at 1 interested director being allowed on the board. There is no hard and fast rule regarding how many interested directors can serve on a board other than compliance with the overarching 40 Act requirement. We're also often asked which officer of the BDC is the most appropriate individual to serve on the board. And again, there's no hard and fast rule here. It truly depends. It's typical to see the CEO or COO or someone in a comparable position serve on the board, but there's no reason that the CFO couldn't serve on the board. This question also comes up recently given that the majority of BDCs are externally managed. And the question is, can someone affiliated with the advisor serve on the board of directors? Clearly that person would be interested, but there's also no reason that an individual from the advisor couldn't also serve on the board to round out having at least a management presence on the board.
And Lisa, one of the things I want to make sure that we focus on is that there are certain items that the board has to address that have to be in person. Does in person mean on the phone?
So unfortunately, I think most people on the phone may already have realized that the 1940 Act is a bit still in the dark ages. We are unable to use teleconference, video conference as a substitute for in-person. When the 1940 Act says in-person, they actually want the directors sitting across from each other at a table in a conference room, which I don't know if Terri mentioned it earlier, but we'll also discuss a little bit later, makes for additional complications when trying to plan an agenda and set an annual compliance calendar.
So there's been a lot of discussion out there about having split between the CEO and an independent chairman outside of the BDC context. Who do you think should be doing that role from a BDC standpoint?
So the independent chair is not required. It's certainly having an independent chair is a corporate governance best practice. But however, if you survey BDCs in the BDC industry, you'll note that the majority of BDCs have an interested individual, most likely the CEO, serving the role of chairman. In order to compensate and realign board balance, which kind of is the overarching goal, most BDCs have implemented and appointed an individual to serve as the lead independent director. Now, the lead independent director role does vary among the industry, but the typical goal is that in addition with all the duties that the director does have as a member of the board, that director is also taking on responsibility to preside over meetings of the board, the independent directors when they're meeting in executive session, as we just discussed. That individual would have the ability to call meetings of the independent directors at will. He or she would also serve as a liaison between the chairman and the independent directors to make that process run a little bit more smoothly. And then finally, it could be a catch-all category where that individual may also assume additional responsibilities, especially in the context of a strategic transaction. If there's a special committee, that individual would also be serving as the chairman of the special committee. Now, the importance of the lead independent director can't be overlooked here because, one, it is a disclosure item. You're going to be asked in your annual and quarterly reports to be able to disclose whether or not you have an independent chair or a lead independent director. And more importantly, when it comes around to the annual meeting time, proxy advisory firms such as ISS, Institutional Shareholder Services, have a policy favoring a vote in favor of boards where there is an independent chairman. The important factor here is It is a mitigating factor in that vote if you have a lead independent director that has a strong presence. And so therefore you end up with a balanced board despite the fact that you have an interested chairman.
So, how does regular communications between the management and the board occur? Or how would you suggest from a best practices standpoint?
So we spent a bit of time earlier, which I won't repeat, regarding the importance of setting an annual compliance calendar, an annual meeting calendar. That's probably your number one line of defense, line of communication with the board.
But we think it's really important.
Yes.
That's why we talked about it third time.
But you know, in my mind, there's three categories of what type of communication I would want to see as a director from my management team. And the first, just to go over them really quickly, one would be quarterly board meetings and the information that's attached to that. Two is ongoing compliance discussions, and three would be real-time communication regarding business developments and other issues that I want to know about as a director. So to fill them out a bit, quarterly board meetings, you know, this is the number one point of contact for boards in management. You're getting information regarding business developments, market trends, how you compare to your peer companies. You're also getting the details on the financial information and performance. And again, with BDCs, and probably most importantly, you're getting detailed information regarding the valuation of the portfolio companies held by the BDC. So that obviously can't be overlooked. And that the benefit there is that's at least 4 points a year where you're getting a hard look at the business and performance of the BDC. Second category is this ongoing compliance discussions. So in addition to the 4 regular in-person meetings that you would have as a director, and Cynthia and Terri also already alluded to this, given the overlay of the 1940 Act, you're going to have constant contact with between the board and the management team. This has to do with regulatory updates, has to do with approvals that are required under the 40 Act, and it also has to do, which we'll touch on a little bit later, compliance reports that you're going to receive from your CCO, any obligations you have complying with listing standards under the NASDAQ and the NYSE if you're listed there. So that kind of gets filters maybe 4 or 5 other meetings throughout the year where you're talking about things that are not related to a filing with the SEC. The last category, which is the one that you know, sometimes brings bad news, is real-time communication between the management team and the directors. As a director, you want a management team that's going to be very open with you and send information when, you know, good and bad. So information regarding a new significant investment that's been made, a change, a new credit facility. On the bad, it would be if there's a litigation or a major compliance issue. And some of those activities would actually require board action, in which case we would do, you could do an unscheduled telephonic board meeting. You could also do a written consent. But I think there's many other times where it's just a best practice to inform the board and keep them in the loop, and board action is actually not required.
So just to give directors a little more information, what should they expect from a CCO? We're assuming that most people have some background with the 38A1 process and the fact that they have policies and procedures in place, and you should be looking at those regularly. But how should the CCO and the directors interact?
So the way I think about this is I think you should have high expectations of all your executive officers, meaning an open line of communication, but the 1940 Act specifically adds extra scrutiny to the relationship that exists between the CCO and the board of directors. I think most of you probably know the 40 Act actually delineates that the CCO reports to the board and the board sets the CCO's salary. So the CCO, in addition to responsibilities of keeping them up to date and monitoring the compliance program and system, the board should have an open line of communication with the CCO. The required reports are an annual compliance report, which we've touched on previously, but I would say that it's an emerging best practice for a CCO to give a quarterly report, compliance report to the board of directors, so that you're not waiting an entire year to get a detailed compliance report. So although that's only happening on a quarterly basis, it is more of a real-time communication tool to keep the executive officers apprised. In addition, there's bringing back the executive session concept again. Executive sessions are always held with the CCO so that the independent directors can have candid discussions with the CCO, and the CCO can do the same with the independent directors to bring to light any issues or compliance concerns they may have.
Great. And then one of the areas I think that a number of directors might have questions about is, since you do have this 40 Act overlay, how can you compensate directors?
So that's a tricky question, and somewhat controversial. But without actually delving into numbers, the compensation concerns for a 40 Act company really depend on whether the BDC in which you serve is an internally managed BDC or an externally managed BDC. If you are internally managed, then compensation structure for a director would be similar to any other operating company. You would receive a retainer. You would also be able to participate in any long-term incentive plans, stock option plans, restricted stock plans. The catch is the majority of the industry here with BDCs is externally managed, and if you are an externally managed BDC, per the overlap or the interplay of the 40 Act and the Advisors Act, you cannot provide an incentive fee to your advisor and also maintain any long-term incentive stock option plans, essentially. So that cuts out option plans, restricted stock plans as a compensation tool. So your compensation is really going to be restricted to retainers and fees for meeting attendance and committee service. Now, if the second part of that question, which I assume it is, well, how much can I expect to get paid as a director? That's going to vary depending on the type of BDC that you serve on. Meaning, do you serve on a publicly traded BDC, private BDC, non-traded BDC? Now, what we've seen emerge recently with the onslaught of private and non-traded BDCs is that compensation for directors is going to be tagged to assets under management. So there's going to be a sliding scale, and that could even mean that until the fund breaks escrow, which could take weeks, could take a year, you may not receive any compensation. So the practices vary, and it's very hard to give a hard line range on compensation.
Right. So that's giving you a background of a little bit about the structure and the responsibilities and basically how management interacts. One thing that we wanted to propose was if people are interested in a survey, because a lot of the information that we've been throwing out is available in the public documents, is that we would be willing to put a survey together if people were interested. So if you could just email us and let us know that you might be interested in a survey, we can certainly undertake maybe to put something together for the industry, because we know that there's not a lot of specific BDC data out there, and it's something that we've looked into before. So just reach out to us if you can. And now I'm going to actually take over the answering, and Terry's going to actually question me.
This is fun to put Cynthia on the hot seat here. These are really, this section is addressing questions that I think a number of you have questions on based on the questions that have been submitted, so hopefully we can answer those here. Cynthia, how do you monitor regulatory developments? Given that this current environment is so fluid, what do you recommend that boards do?
Yes, and as a result of the fact that things have been changing and there's been hot topics that have come in and out of the regulatory focus, we've actually been spending more time in this area as well and trying to aggregate the information in a way that it's something that people can take in, and it's not like a fire hose. So we've actually developed a regulatory update in a memorandum format that we make available to our clients. We basically provide that so that it could be used as a part of the board materials, And so it's not something that the board necessarily has to address. If there's something of any real significance, we may very well bring it up and talk about it. But I do think that something of that nature, whether it's a memo or a PowerPoint, that I do think that some type of a regulatory update for the board members, because that's what we're really talking about, is how do you guys keep up to date and keep in touch with the industry. That's what I would suggest.
Speaking of regulatory updates, has there been any particular activity that the SEC has been focused on recently?
Absolutely. And we've spent time on, at the roundtable as well as other webinars talking through some of these matters. So I'm going to touch on things lightly today, but just to know that there's been a lot of activity. And one of the areas that the SEC has focused on in the past year is the private equity industry, basically how their conflicts of interest are dealt with, how fees are dealt with, how they're paid. All of those types of issues are something that have been making their way through the OC and the examination process, as well as through some enforcement cases. And one of the areas that I wanted just to mention was the allocation of expenses and fees. And I think Terri mentioned it at the outset, but I really do want to make sure that this is something, again, that I think has come up to a level that probably needs to be addressed on a quarterly basis. And it certainly can be handled very easily through a schedule, but it's something that I think the board members need to have information on. And again, whether it's in writing or it's an oral presentation, there really does need to be some type of a discussion about fees and expenses, especially if you're in a platform or there's a number of funds that the manager is working for. So, and I think that you can actually look at the Apollo case that we've talked about kind of in depth in other circumstances, where there was an issue there wasn't a policy being followed, and there was some fees being charged, or at least according to the SEC, charged in advance of when they should have been. What I will note is that one of the things that the SEC spent a fair bit of time on was that Apollo actually, as an organization, had cooperated extensively, and so even if a company or a fund does get in some regulatory hot water, one of the things you want to do is make sure that your management team is being forthright with the SEC and that you're cooperating, because that is one of the ways that you very well may avoid some type of a penalty or something along those lines. The other area I would talk about a little bit, and this was actually in the last webinar that we did, was the whistleblowing. The SEC came out with a risk alert on that, and what they pointed out was that in certain severance agreements, there was situations where, at least from the SEC's perspective, people were being deterred from going to the SEC if they had a complaint in connection with the whistleblower program. And actually, BlackRock just had a situation where they paid a fee, not a large fee, but a fee, because they had severance agreements that the SEC determined were out of compliance. They not only had to pay the fee, they also had to change all their severance agreements. So I think you want to be really careful in the whistleblowing area. There's actually been penalties paid of over $1 million in that area. So if you haven't looked at that yet, you haven't looked at your policies and procedures and any severance agreements you might have, you need to make sure that you've done that. Another area, every year the SEC's Office of Compliance Inspection Examinations comes out with areas of focus. And one of the areas which I wanted to point out, because it is something that especially non-tradeds deal with, is that the SEC is going to be focusing on matters that are important to retail investors. So I do think that whenever you're going out to retail investors, and the fact that BDCs can offer to any investor, you definitely want to make sure that you're monitoring that not only at the SEC level but at the FINRA level. The other area of focus is risks related to elderly and retiring investors, and then the last one is market-wide and structural risks. And that's really, those are very broad focus areas. So I don't know exactly what the SEC is going to come out with, but they have been, fairly active in this area, and especially when they point up that there's something going on.
So you're speaking about where the SEC's focused. Have they had enforcement actions in these areas?
Well, there's definitely been enforcement actions in connection with the issues around private equity. And for example, I'll just go through a couple of them. There's been enforcement actions for failure to disclose the fees, inappropriate policies. There's actually been a case against the evaluation procedure, and then there's also been a number against auditors. And also there's been one against a fund for failure to educate their sales force. Again, that goes along the line, I think, with the focus that I just mentioned.
So Cynthia, let's switch topic a little bit and talk about what's going on in this current administration and what should BDC directors expect in terms of changes to the regulatory landscape from the Trump administration.
Well, if I could actually answer that question. I think what you've heard that administration will be a little bit lighter on regulation. I don't know if that's going to be later on the regulatory front or on the enforcement. I do think that if you were to look at the new SEC nominee for chairman, it does look like he may very well be more focused on capital formation, so that may be something where we may get some relief. But there are issues around the fact that effectively there has been an executive order freezing all new federal employees by the new administration and new regulatory actions similar to what I talked about at the outset. Now, the SEC, we're not 100% sure how that's going to weigh because they're an independent agency, but you can imagine that there's going to be some starts and stops, is the way I'd put it. And there very well may be some changes in the staff at the SEC. There's been a number of resignations announced, which is normal in a change of administration. However, I think there are some more spots than necessarily you would expect. So I think that it's going to, like I said, we might be at a little bit of a stop, and it'll get started more when people are in place. But it's going to be a little bit of a difficult thing to predict. And you might want to factor in a little bit more time if you've got something that you need from the SEC.
And with the Trump administration's agenda in mind, should directors expect major changes in SEC enforcement activity or regulatory activity in 2017?
Again, that's a little difficult to say, and obviously the agency has a lot to say about that too. That I would think really goes to the individual who's the chair. I think that's more where the direction comes from, and that the nominee today is John Clayton from Sullivan and Cromwell. So once he gets in place, I think we'll have a much better idea about how that's going to resolve itself. But again, the securities laws are very complex and difficult to administer. So I'm not sure that we're going to have 100% determination on how that's all going to play out for 6-8 months. Definitely beyond the 100 days.
What about legislative changes? Can you address what legislative changes you're expecting from Congress in 2017 and beyond?
Yeah, in connection with that, there's been a lot of discussion about Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank does have some impact on BDCs and the Volcker Rule and that type of thing. It's unclear whether that's going to actually come to play in the administration, but it's not as impactful as something that was directly related to BDCs, and BDCs will have somewhat less impact on where it goes. So I think that's another little bit of a wait-and-see situation. But again, it's a day-to-day thing.
And then, of course, it's the million-dollar question, which is, what does the new administration mean for BDC legislation?
This is a favorite question that everybody has to ask us on a regular basis. I think that you really can't predict timing, but my assessment is the legislation that's been proposed in the last Congress, the prospect of it actually coming to fruition has gone way up. There's new members of the administration that were actually a part of some of that legislative drafting. Mulvaney was one of the people who actually was involved in the last Congress, and it was his proposed legislation that was being considered, or at least one of them. So that just gives a whole different perspective on where we are. So I would expect that depending on the legislative calendar and where we are, that you might see some movement there, but it's kind of a wait and see. What I will say is that it's really important for BDCs to have people in the administration who understand them, understand the model, understand the product. A lot of the education that we've been dealing with in the past few years is really kind of going to pay off. So I think that we won't have to start every conversation on explaining what we are or what the vehicle is. We'll be able to rely on the fact that people have some knowledge of that. So just going through these regulatory issues, you can see that there's a number of them out there that you have to deal with. We didn't even touch on kind of cybersecurity or the DOL rule. Again, those will hopefully be something that we address in the future on other webinars. To the extent people would like to hear about them. One thing I wanted to mention, if anybody wants the quotes from the materials that I read out at the beginning of the call, just let me know or send me an email, and we'll send that along. So I think we have just a few minutes to take one or two questions, and to the extent we don't get to your question before the hour's up, just give us a call and give one of the three of us a call, and we'll try and help you out. Terri, could you read?
Sure. Cynthia, can you talk a little bit about the importance of keeping board conversations in the boardroom and also about the use of email?
That's actually a great one. I would strongly urge directors to the fact that the information that they have in hand is something that is, most of it is non-public. And you don't want to be making a determination of whether it's material or not. So I would say that the conversations regarding any type of board activity that is not something that's in the public arena, you would want to stay away from. I think it's actually just better for directors to stay out of conversations about any kind of board determinations or where a company's going, that type of thing. And email, I would even more strongly suggest that you don't, certainly email is a function and you can provide reports and information and board materials and that type of thing, but I don't think you should have conversations over over email. That the SEC in connections with exams will request email. So you don't want something to look like it's been determined or that there was an issue or something that could be taken out of context that you'll be answering for. I've heard that if you actually have one page, for example, of notes, similar to kind of an email, you could have hundreds of hours of depositions. So I think that unfortunately might take us to the end. Thank you for joining us. Again, if you have other questions, feel free to reach out to us. Just send us a quick email. And stay tuned for the next session. Like I said, we're hoping to do one on valuation and 15C process. And if there's actually a topic that you would like to hear about, just again email us and let us know. And we're happy to continue this program if people think it's helpful. And have a good day. And thank you very much.
This concludes today's conference. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time and have a wonderful rest of your day.